My name is Penny Dreadful. The great house on top of Widow's Hill is a dark and frightening place to end a journey. The ghosts of yesterday seem to tell me to run, but I am here now, and there's no turning back from the terror at Collinwood. Be careful, my friend, where you tread, for I warn you now, there are spoilers ahead. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. 'Tis I, Penny Dreadful, and I am now leaving the body of Danielle Galerter, and I am joined by Rachel Pulliam, who is the creator of the audio drama company Soul Twin Audios. She is an actress, writer, and producer, and also hosts the show Dark Paradise, which examines both dark shadows and strange paradise. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh my goodness, my pleasure. Well, a while back you played my promo on your show. You asked for a promo, and that was very nice of you to do. And then you sent me one. I asked you to send me one later, and we traded promos, which was fun. And at one point, we're talking before the show. You tagged me on a post and said one of your voiceover goals was to be a guest on Terror at Collinwood. So here we are. Sorry it took so long.
Oh, I'm just happy to be here.
Oh, it's my pleasure to have you here. And with that in mind, I think I've promised guest appearances to about a dozen people now at this point who are still waiting. I've been doing the show now for 2 years, and over the years, it's like I've come across several people that are like, oh, I'd love to have them on, or etc. But sometimes it just takes a little while as things happen. But I'm glad we could finally do this here because I really enjoy your podcast, Dark Paradise, which covers both dark shadows and strange paradise. And I'd love to talk a little bit about your show. But before we get to that, tell me a little bit about your own interest in dark shadows. I see you're a fan of the Gothic and the Gothic ingenue. You talk a lot about that, which we're going to talk about a bit about Victoria Winters today. But I'd love to know how you got into dark shadows, if you would.
Oh gosh. Well, first of all, I'm wearing a Dark Shadows t-shirt, but nobody can probably see it, unfortunately, because of the camera angle. But I got into Dark Shadows back when I was in middle school. It was kind of a fluke thing. It was a snow day, so I was off. And I was just flipping through the channels, and I came across the Sci-Fi Channel. And I'll never forget it. I think I was about maybe 13 or 14 years old. And here's this lady, blonde hair, in a green dress from a different time period with a voodoo doll. And I was just transfixed. I'm like, what is this? What is going on? And then all of a sudden, as the episode continued, Barnabas starts choking and all this other stuff, and I'm watching, and I think my mom even came downstairs and told me, she's like, oh, you're watching Dark Shadows, and I'm like, what is that? And she wasn't really an avid fan, so it was just kind of like I found it by accident one day on a snow day, so that's just kind of cool like that.
Now, this was, you said, a Sci-Fi Channel?
Yeah, so this was probably back in 1992, 1993.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so did you get into Dark Shadows before you got into Strange Paradise?
I did, yes.
Okay, so how did Strange Paradise come into this?
The funny thing is, I think I discovered, or at least the name of it, in a Dark Shadows book, maybe the Almanac. It was just a footnote. It was like, here are other things or other films based on or similar to Dark Shadows. And it was like this other Gothic soap opera, but in Canada. And I didn't actually get to watch it until years later. I somehow stumbled upon it again, and there was a website selling episodes of it, which is kind of, they shouldn't have done that, but how else are we going to see it? Unlike MPI that puts out Dark Shadows, Strange Paradise wasn't offered the same opportunity. But yeah, I stumbled across it probably back in, I want to say, maybe 2008. And then I joined a Yahoo group. At the time, there was a Yahoo group, and there was probably, a handful of people that contributed to that. And that's kind of how I started getting into it. I bought one of the volumes, and then on the Yahoo group, I made friends. Unfortunately, I lost touch with him, but he was from Canada, and he had all the episodes, and he just mailed them to me.
Wow, cool. That's
Yeah,
nice. That's the
yeah.
great thing about fandom, is that there people help each other out like that. I love that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear a defense a bit of Strange Paradise, because my own history with that show. I mean, I haven't watched all of it. I've watched I watched a chunk of it. My uncle told me about my uncle Valdemar, who I've mentioned on the show a number of times. He was a huge Dark Shadows fan, and he also watched Strange Paradise when that came on, because it had a similar vibe to Dark Shadows, and he was a big horror fan, and he got into Strange Paradise for a little while there. And it was because it was syndicated. It must have, in this neck of the woods. It must have been like 69 around that time. And he did watch it and used to tell me about it. He said, oh, there was this other show, Strange Paradise, that was similar to Dark Shadows, except it was like voodoo and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, oh, that sounds pretty cool. But I could never find it. Like you said, it was hard to find Strange Paradise. It wasn't easily or readily available. And then I met Steve Shutt on the Dark
Mm-hmm.
Shadows, in the Dark Shadows fandom. And he's a friend. He's been on my podcast as well several times, and on yours too. And we met up. My late husband and I met him up in Salem, and he brought a VHS tape for me of Strange Paradise episodes. He put a bunch of episodes on a tape, so I finally got to watch Strange Paradise, and I really enjoyed it, especially Raxel. I really loved
Oh
Cosette
yeah,
Lee's Raxel.
she's great, which is why I want to discuss her along with Angelique,
Yeah, all good.
because I
Yeah,
think that's probably the closest comparison you've got.
absolutely. That'll be a great comparison between those two characters for sure. And I enjoyed it. It has you can see this, there are certainly it was definitely inspired by the success of Dark Shadows.
Mm-hmm.
And it was some of the Dark Shadows alumni went to Strange Paradise. Producer Robert Costello, writer Ron Sproat, Joe Caldwell, I think, wrote a couple episodes there.
Right.
So there were some Dark Shadows alumni involved, and it's often dismissed as a knockoff of Dark Shadows, and people kind of look like, oh, it's that knockoff version of Dark Shadows. But I feel it has its own identity. It definitely stands on its own. It has its own vibe, and it's spooky and cool. So what is it about Strange Paradise that you think is worth checking out for fans maybe who haven't seen it?
Well, I mean, first of all, going back into Dark Shadows, it borrows heavily from Gothic literature.
Yeah.
And similarly, I guess you could argue that Strange Paradise does the same thing a little bit, but it still does its own thing. Since both of them are in the Gothic vein, there is going to be some overlap, obviously. But the thing that I really loved was the actor Colin Fox. And I guess you could compare him easily to Barnabas Collins, which is, what Jonathan Fred, which is what I did in my first episode of Dark Paradise. But he's just so wonderful as this dual character of Jacques Elmois de Mons. And he both Colin Fox and Cosette Lee really keep you intrigued and interested in Strange Paradise. And as far as plot goes, it takes place on Maljardin, this island, or it begins on Maljardin. And I thought that was really different, because it's not, the typical New England setting like Dark Shadows. And then, of course, when Robert Costello took over, I guess they hired him because they wanted to make it more like Dark Shadows. So they moved it from the island to some unknown location in New England. But yeah, I really loved the whole voodoo vibe, and the opening theme with the drums, and the silent, gentle zombie character of Quito, which you don't have in Dark Shadows. I always compare him to Tor Johnson.
Yes.
He
Oh,
kind of looks
great.
like
Yeah,
Tor Johnson.
he does. Yeah. I'm sure that was intentional too. They must
It
have.
probably was. Yeah.
Yeah. There you can find Strange Paradise episodes on YouTube if you know where to look. So you can
Right.
find them on there. Yeah, is there how many episodes are there total? Do you know?
195. I believe there was a lost one. Whether or not the lost one actually has turned up on YouTube, I'm not sure. You could also check out Bizarre Elysium on Soul Twin Audios.
Yeah,
I've just uploaded episode 23 in
great.
black and white if people, want to end up checking that out.
Yeah,
Bizarre
yeah.
Elysium.
It will lead you in the right direction. We'll put,
Right.
is there a reason that the show maybe hasn't attained? It has its own following. There are big fans of it. Do you think that there's a reason why it hasn't hit more kind of a mainstream audience? Is it because it was a Canadian only show, or is it just people are less aware of it because of that? Or
I think part of it is because it did only last the 195 episodes. So it and I think also because it only had maybe a few channels. It only appeared in America on a few limited run.
right.
I know that there was one channel that was actually running it back to back with Dark Shadows. And I think that that's really awesome. But also, I think, the Dark Shadows fan base maybe hurt it a little because, yeah, they are comparing it to Dark Shadows. And so they, the fact that they're dismissive of it. But I mean, it's hard to it's hard to be able to say that it's completely faded away, but I have to say that if the copyright holders had given it the opportunity to actually have a run on MPI, because MPI did approach them and say, hey, we want to give it the Dark Shadows treatment, but they said no.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah, they said, I don't know how long ago that was, but had MPI been able to distribute it like Dark Shadows, I believe it would have had the following that it deserves.
Yeah. Was this Canadian Broadcasting Company that put it out, or
Krantz, I think.
Grant?
I don't know who owns it now.
Gosh, that's a
I'm
shame
not sure.
that they
Starts with
would.
an M.
Okay.
An N. I can't think of the name of the company off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's a shame that MPI kind of that they did turn down MPI. Gosh, that
Yeah,
would
I
have
mean,
been perfect.
I guess they weren't offering them enough money. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, the company that holds the copyright, they're not doing anything with the show. It's just sitting, around somewhere. And I mean, in a way, I'm kind of glad that it is obscure because I feel safe in creating my little fan fiction audios, and I don't feel like I'm going to get bothered or a C and D slapped on me or anything like that because nobody cares
Right, right. Well, I
except for me
mean, well,
and a
no,
handful.
and your listeners, surely. So,
Yeah.
but that's a great segue because I'd love to talk about your podcast or your show, Dark Paradise, and also your Soul Twin audios and the plays, the audio plays that you've been putting out. So, can you talk to us a little bit about Soul Twin audios and your podcast, Dark Paradise?
Sure. So I started Soul Twin Audios back in August of 2021. I actually had other podcasts several years back, but I came up with this name finally, and it's just stuck. So, but my podcast, my tagline, as it were, stories created solely with the vintage soul in mind, and I like to create things with a vintagey, old timey kind of vibe. So I do my old time radio recreations of suspense. We just recently released Sorry Wrong Number.
Oh, great.
Which I thought came out fantastic. Julia Hoverson starred in that. And she's worked with me in the past. She's got her Nocturne Boulevard site. And oh gosh, other things that we've done in more of like the gothic vein. Because I take Dark Shadows as inspiration to figure out some of the shows I want to do or recreate. So we've done Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, and The Lottery,
Oh,
which
great. Yeah.
and Turn of the Screw, which is one I adapted myself from the novella by Henry James, which is really good. So there is that part of Soul Twin Audios. I also have my Dark Paradise series that I really wanted to do a podcast about Dark Shadows, but considering that there are several other podcasts out there, including your wonderful podcast,
Oh,
and Between the Shadows and Residents of Collinwood, I'm like, how am I going to make mine a little bit different? So that's when I decided, hey, I want to talk about Strange Paradise too, and maybe make those connections between Dark Shadows and Strange Paradise, and hopefully maybe build a fan base a little bit of Strange Paradise fans. But my first episode of Dark Paradise, I talked a little bit about Jean-Paul Desmond, the hero anti-hero of Strange Paradise, and of course Barnabas Collins. And then the second episode, I had you on the show.
Yes.
Oh
Yeah.
gosh, and we talked about just all kinds of stuff regarding Dark Shadows. But and as I mentioned to you previously, I'm still working on getting my fourth episode. Now it'll be the fourth episode produced of where I talk about Angelique and Raxel.
And you're doing, and you mentioned a crossover too. You're doing a fiction crossover. You're doing with Strange Paradise and Dark Shadows. Yeah.
Yes, I call it Cursed Dwellings.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also working on another thing. I want to do creepypasta, but we can get to that in another minute or two. But Cursed Dwellings, I really wanted to create a storyline, and for me that talked about Victoria Winter's parentage.
Yeah.
Now I know we're kind of jumping around a little bit, but yeah, Cursed Dwellings. So the protagonist is Betty Hanscom, and it's all about her past, but I also tie it into Strange Paradise. So this is like an alternative reality, parallel time kind of universe where Strange Paradise and Dark Shadows get to meet.
Awesome. And is this all available on your YouTube channel?
Yes, and also on Anchor and probably Apple. When I upload it to Anchor, it goes to other platforms automatically.
So would they look up Soul Twin Audios? This is how they would find it.
Yes.
Look up SOLE Twin Audios, and you can find all of this great content that Rachel has been producing. And the quality of your productions is really fantastic. Like the audio quality is, you can tell you have a lot of experience doing this with voiceover and editing, and it sounds very, very crisp and clear and very, very slick. Now you mentioned, well, let's for creepypasta. I want to throw that out there too, because I only found out a few years ago what creepypasta was. I heard it was like, what is this? Is this like a spooky Italian restaurant? Like, what is creepypasta? I was like, I don't know what this is. So I looked it up, and it's people reading, like telling scary stories online, right? On audio, on like YouTube and stuff. So can you talk about creepypastas and what your interest is in that?
I have to say, I'm not even 100% certain I understand what it is. It's just for me, and putting it into the Dark Shadows universe and with audio drama, I think they just have like a single narrator, like you said, reading a story, usually somebody that can perform and read all the voices. But I actually am going with, a narrator. I'm going to do this like creepy obituary writer type character. And
cool.
I cast this guy. I still need to like finish everything up for that, but I've got some of that temporarily on hold while I finish up my old time radio stuff. But he's just phenomenal, Ray O'Hare, and he's my obituary writer, and he does I don't want to give away the plot just yet, but my first story is going to involve Court Desmond in Strange Paradise and Carolyn Stoddard.
Oh,
So it's if trying to speak now. It's as if they met in college, and it's going to be about what happens to them before. Again, I can't give it away, but it's going to be good.
awesome. And this is also will be under the Soul Twin Audios
Yes.
banner. Okay.
Actually, I have that. So I've got Dark Paradise as kind of a separate thing, but it's again all under the same banner. So there's Dark Paradise Retrospection, where I talk about the 2 soap operas, and then I've got Cursed Dwellings, the Dark Paradise Saga, where I mingle Dark Shadows and Strange Paradise, and then with the fan fiction of Betty Hanscom and her involvement with the Collins family and all of that, and also again this Faceless Terrors, which is Dark Paradise Creepypasta.
Wow, a lot of great content that will be available there on Soul Twin Audios. And I'm glad you also mentioned Between the Shadows and Resident of Collinwood, who are also producing great content. So there's so much really cool content connected to Dark Shadows that I certainly would encourage fans to check out, because there's a lot that to enjoy out there, plus past episodes of the Collinsport Historical Society podcast, which are still available if you haven't heard that. So it was Wallace McBride and Patrick McRae. So there's a lot of really cool stuff out there, and Rachel's constant. I always see you posting new stuff, so that's really great. So you mentioned Victoria Winter's Parentage,
Yes.
and that's one of the things I want to talk with you about today. You just posted an episode recently about Shadows on the Wall, which is, of course, the Art Wallace story Bible. There we are. We both have it.
Oh, we have a copy.
Yeah.
$100. How much was yours?
Oh God, I don't remember. It's been a while, but it was not cheap. I had a version when it first came out that I bought back in the day, and then I sold it, and then I rebought it, and when I rebought it, I paid a lot more for it than I did the first time, because it was out of print by then. But I did have it before, and I picked it up again. But it's this is Art Wallace's story Bible for Dark Shadows, and I often talk about Dan Curtis, but I don't talk enough about Art Wallace, who was an extremely key and important figure in the history of Dark Shadows. Art Wallace wrote the story Bible for Dark Shadows. He wrote these first several months of episodes, and then I think there was the first 8 weeks he wrote on his own, and then he Francis Swan was brought in, and he co-wrote like another 9 weeks or something with Francis Swan. So he was an integral part of Dark Shadows. And of course, Dan Curtis had the famous dream about the girl on the train arriving at the house, which is very Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is sort of the archetype for this, orphaned girl in search of answers who arrives at this brooding mansion, but Art Wallace really developed these characters and this world in his Shadows on the Wall Bible. And subsequently, things changed. Obviously, we went into the supernatural, and things in the Bible that Art Wallace wrote, some of them didn't come to fruition. Some did, like Roger originally was supposed to die. He doesn't die in the show. Thankfully, we kept Louis Edmonds on for the rest of Dark Shadows. How sad would that have been if we had lost poor Louis Edmonds? He was so great. But it was definitely an important template. He was pulling from his own script for was it Playhouse? Goodyear Playhouse.
I think it was the Web.
Was it the Web?
I think it was the Web. Actually, there were 2 different versions of this, I think.
Okay, because I remember Goodyear.
He had it on the Web, and he also had it on Playhouse 90.
Okay. Goodyear Playhouse. It was in the 50s. It was like 57, I think. And it was like a very, he pulled a lot of ideas from that and repurposed them for Dark Shadows. And there were elements also of The Uninvited, the movie. But he fleshed out the character of Victoria Winters in this Bible, and Sheila March, she was originally going to be called. She arrives at Collinwood. She's in the Hammond Foundling home. She starts getting an envelope every month with $50, She's an orphan. When she was left at the foundling home, there was a note that says, her name is Victoria, I cannot take care of her. And so in the postmarked in Bangor, Maine. So she shows up and she's looking for answers about her parentage, which sadly, as Dark Shadows fans know, this was never resolved. And Victoria is cut from the same cloth as Jane Eyre and all of these Gothic ingenues, which I know you're a big fan of. I noticed when you talk a lot about this sort of the Gothic ingenue, and it's kind of your jam, I noticed. So I'd love to hear about your interest in Victoria Winters as a character, but also your thoughts on what her parentage is, as Art Wallace laid out in his story Bible. And I'm going to offer some other alternatives as things progressed with Alexander Moltke, etc., because there are other theories as well, because this was never answered. This is all speculation. And I know people point, oh, Return to Collinwood definitively answered it. To me, Return to Collinwood is not definitive. Unless it happened in the show. I can't. It's all speculation. I know what they were planning to do, or they were thinking of doing, and they were going to deviate from what was in the story Bible. But it is a legitimate theory. Art Wallace came up with it. So tell us what you think about all this.
Oh gosh, where do I start? So for me, Victoria Winters, a lot of fans like to think that she's just stupid. Even Alexander Moltke didn't really enjoy playing her because she was too nice, and sometimes she appeared like she didn't have a clue. But I don't believe she started out that way. I mean, she shows up, she's very inquisitive, she's there with a goal, she wants to find out her past. And even though a couple of times she's like, oh, I'm just going to go, I've had it, this kid doesn't like me, I'm just going to give up. But then Carolyn, of course, talks her out of it. But I mean, Victoria is just, she's not an idiot. But unfortunately, I think as her character progressed and the plots got more involved with Barnabas Collins, they shifted from making her the protagonist to making Barnabas and other supernatural characters the protagonist. And so I'm disappointed that she got such a bad break.
Yeah, she was very intrepid. She was really trying with David and exploring all the catchphrase for Victoria is "I don't understand."
Yeah.
Which she does say a lot, but that isn't all Victoria Winters is. And I think, like all of the other, human characters, the family members, etc., they kind of all went to the background and became victims as the kind of the monsters, especially led by Barnabas, as the supernatural and eccentric, the mad scientist-esque Julia and Barnabas and Angelique and Quentin all kind of took the center stage here. The characters like Victoria kind of became more victim type characters, but she was the protagonist of the series for a very long time. I know you agree with Art Wallace's sort of description of what her parentage was going to be. So can you talk about that a little bit and why you side with that version?
Fans, of course, most of the fans know by now what direction Art Wallace was going to take it. Victoria was supposed to be the daughter of Paul Stoddard. And he was going to have he had an affair. We don't know with who, but I like how in Art Wallace's book, he talks about how Victoria confronts Liz and finally gets Liz to explain to her, at least in part, who she was. She states, at least in his book, Paul is your father. But I don't know who your mother was. And I like to believe that, because people argue about this point all the time, about their reasoning behind thinking that Liz is Vicky's mom. I like to believe that Liz is a little bit classier than just putting her daughter up in some foundling home. to be just abandoned, even though she was giving her money. Although, yeah, I think she was the one giving the money. Although I think in the book, I think it was mentioned that Paul possibly gave the money, and that the handwriting was Paul's on the envelope that she discovered in the locked room when David had locked her in a room. I think she found some of his handwriting or something on an envelope or something.
So Paul, so you're sticking with Paul as the
I'm
father.
sticking with Paul Stoddard, and I like to believe that Betty Hanscom is Vicky's mom,
Okay.
because in, I want to say, episode 60, and fans will just call this a red herring, but she discovers the portrait of Betty Hanscom.
Yeah.
And as everyone knows, that's actually Alexandra Moltke that sat in for that portrait. And they just kind of dismiss it. Oh, that was her sister, or that was a cousin or some other relation. But I mean, for me, it was just kind of cut and dry. I mean, that was Vicky's mom to me. Now, again, and I think in the same episode, Sam Evans tells Victoria that that couldn't have been her mom, because Betty Hanscom died like in, I want to say, like 2 or 3 years before Victoria was supposedly born. But my defense again is Sam Evans was an alcoholic, and he possibly doesn't remember certain things. And of course, I'm going to use this in Cursed Dwellings, because my whole angle of creating Cursed Dwellings is to talk about Victoria's parentage. And that doesn't give away too much, because there's all that strange paradise stuff in there that I'm going to put that people are just going to hopefully enjoy as well.
Mhm. Now, all this said, as we mentioned earlier, the things in the Art Wallace Bible, some things made it into the show, some things didn't. The Roger dying, or Laura Collins being from Phoenix, not being a Phoenix, these things. There were things, and Vicky going on trial for the murder of Laura and all this kind of stuff did not make it into the show. Although some things did, some things didn't.
Right. And some things were tweaked a little bit.
Yeah. I give you credit for being bold enough to kind of stick with this, Paul, because that's definitely not the prevailing fandom theory that everybody wants her to be Liz's daughter. And
I mean, even Joan Bennett, you probably saw the video.
Yeah.
And I believe this was a fan that just,
it was Guy Haynes. Yeah, he filmed Joan Bennett saying that. Yeah.
I mean, and I think Joan Bennett probably believed that. There's also, I read in like the Almanac or something that said that Alexandra felt that she was cast because she looked a little bit like Joan
It was
Bennett.
the Dark Shadows companion.
The Almanac, the companion, right?
I brought, and Dark Shadows the first year as well.
I have that.
Yeah. They which is a republished version of the history of Dark Shadows, which is put out at the festival. But this, according to these, Alexandra, when she came in, she was cast because of her resemblance to Joan Bennett, and the writers then changed gears and decided, well, she's going to be Liz's daughter instead. But they never got to that. And there were ideas bandied about, like Hanscom, the butler, Betty Hanscom's dad was going to be the father. That was one thing. And then at one point they were even considered Jason McGuire as the father. They were bandying around ideas. They never, ultimately, as we know, they never did. So it's really up for debate at this point. We have the Return to Collinwood, which says she's Liz's daughter. There was another audio drama that went there, but again, I don't consider the audio dramas canon.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, go for it. Go
I
ahead.
like to believe that the audio dramas produced by Big Finish and also Return to Collinwood are basically like alternative universes, parallel time.
Agreed. Yeah.
And when you think of it that way, it makes it a little bit more enjoyable.
Yes.
I mean, because the whole let's make a version where Victoria is definitely Liz's daughter, and we pass around a letter and we all read it, and it's very, I couldn't get into that either. But I don't know.
I think of it as a parallel time
Yes.
as well. I mean, my personal opinion, I like the idea of her being Liz's daughter, and I know what you mean about it's not too classy for Liz. But my thought is like this is this old New England family. Liz always concerned about the Collins name. You know, when David tried to murder his own father with the bleeder
Right.
valve, she had, you know, the sheriff kind of keep quiet about it. So I could see if she had a baby out of wedlock with Hanscom, or maybe even before she married Paul Stoddard and had Carolyn, maybe, you know, I don't, a little before. I don't, it would be hard for Liz to hide a pregnancy though. She'd have to like leave Collinsport for a time
Right.
to make that happen. There are some hoops you have to jump through to make it work. I think it could work. Now there's a third theory that is not mentioned very often, and I think it was Joe, I want to say it was Joe Escobar when I had him on this podcast, had another interesting theory, and I'm sorry if it wasn't Joe, but I think it was, that Vicky is actually not Liz's daughter, not Paul Stoddard's daughter, but she is actually Jameson's daughter, and that she is Liz's sister, not her, and that Jameson had her later in life out of wedlock. He had, like, as an older man, he had a child, and that Vicky is that, I mean, I'm just putting that out there too, because that's an interesting, that's a
It,
one that I haven't heard very often, but I'm
it's
like, whoa, that's
funny that you should
compelling.
mention. It's funny that you should mention that because I used to run a Dark Shadows group, where we would role play as the characters,
Mhm.
and someone else was going to role play that idea, which I
Oh,
agreed to because I was playing Victoria at the time,
uh-huh.
and I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting idea that I could get behind, specifically just for this RPG.
Yeah,
Um, but
it's
it was
compelling. It's
it
gonna
is
come.
it's interesting. It's different, and of course, I also read another theory tied into the Marilyn Ross books
Mhm.
of an article. I think is Craig. I For the life of me, I can't remember his last name, but he had permission to write up an article
Oh,
discussing.
Craig Hamrick.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Mhm.
You probably know where I'm going with this. He had written up an article that he had permission to do so by Marilyn Ross, Dan Ross, and he had this whole storyline where Barnabas was actually going to turn out to be Victoria's father.
Wow,
I
that's
know that's
wild.
talk about your leap there,
Yeah,
you
that's
know.
really wild. Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
and I before we really segue into anything else, I wanted to bring up this point. Not that it still kind of ties into Victoria as a character. You know, after Alexandra left, she was recast twice. Once by Betsy Durkin and Carolyn Groves, um, and then of course wrote her. They wrote Victoria out of the story with the whole Jeb killing her on Widow's
Yeah.
Hill, and
Yeah.
I never cared for that. I thought that that was really in bad form of Dan Curtis to just kill her off like that. But and I'm sitting there going, instead of bringing on Kate Jackson as Daphne Harridge as
Oh
another
my God.
governess,
Yes. Yeah.
why couldn't they have just given her the role of Victoria? It would have worked out so well. Or
Agreed.
brought back Alexandra Moltke in parallel time when they had parallel time going on and let her be the bad guy.
Yeah.
Victoria as a bad guy. She wanted to play the villain. And I think that that would have been really interesting to do, but
Agreed.
they never went there.
No, there's a fanfic. Charles Delaware Troll wrote this like additional year of Dark Shadows. He wrote like episode synopses for total fanfic, but he had that same idea that it's a parallel time, 1870 or something, and Alexandra plays a succubus in his version of she's a villain in that timeline. But I always thought that as well with regard to Kate Jackson. Like if they had done present day timeline, they could have recast Vicky with Kate Jackson, and I think she was a really good actress, or she is a really good actress, and I think she would have been she bore some resemblance to Alexandra. She had that long dark hair. She had that
Yes.
kind of whole vibe to her, so I think she would have been a very good Vicky. And I do want to give props to Betsy Durkin and Carolyn Groves, who especially Betsy gets some hate from the fandom, but I thought she did a really good job as Vicky. I mean, I love Alexandra Moltke is Victoria Winters to me. Like that is Victoria Winters. But I think Betsy and Carolyn Groves did a nice job. And Betsy actually did show some, like I said, well, they became victims, the humans became victims, but Vicky actually, even later on, continued to show moxie. She was the hero. She was a heroic character, a pure good person, and Betsy, she went face to face with Nicholas and accused him of being a warlock. She
Right.
I mean, that takes a lot of guts to to do that. And I love her relationship with, I liked her and Burke, but I also loved her and Peter too. Peter was very sweet. I liked Peter. Jeff was kind of when he was Jeff Clark, he was
creepy.
He was messed up. Jeff Clark was kind of messed up, so the
so
sweetness of Peter got kind of trampled a little bit there. I liked Burke too. The Mitch Ryan's Burke Devlin. I thought he had good chemistry with Alexandra, and I thought they were setting up this whole storyline with the two of them, with them moving into this house, and then they kind of dropped that. What are your, if I know Mark B. Perry is talking about, this reincarnation show he's going to have, there's definitely seems to be a Victoria Winters element to this show. And you mentioned the Jeb Hawks, Vicky jumping off Widow's Hill. And when I interviewed Mark, I brought that up. I said, are you going to address the fact that, she died in the show? I mean, it is mentioned in the show. And he said,
killed her off.
He said, did you see the body? I was like, good point. You didn't see the body, so, and he dropped this hint that Victoria is a temporal vagabond. So I like this idea that Vicky is gets whisked around in time, because she seemed to keep getting sucked back to the 18th century and then back to the present and back to the 18th century again. So maybe Vicky is can't stay in one time for very long. I don't know. There's some interesting stuff to consider there, because I hate to think that that's how Vicky went out ultimately, was that was off-screen death of Victoria Winters. When I first saw that, I was stunned. I was like, wow, this is how Vicky's dead. Like, she didn't get that happy ending after all, apparently.
It was such a throwaway.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't remember now what they were going to do instead, but then for some reason they had to bring back in Peter Bradford to reveal all this stuff, and it just didn't make a whole lot of sense. I don't know. I'm kind of curious to see what Mark is going to do with it. I think I read that he was going to have Victoria have a daughter, and that kind of confused me, because I'm like, again, how is that going to happen if she's dead? So, I don't know. We'll have to see what happens.
Well, if we go with the idea that she somehow survived, like when she went, I think he also mentioned when they were going to hang her in 1795, she disappeared and swapped places with Phyllis Wick and came back to so maybe something similar, although there's no Phyllis Wick now to swap places with, but maybe she somehow she can't die if she's outside of her own time. I don't know. But I like the idea that Vicky, that wasn't the end of Victoria Winters. And the reason, I guess one of the reasons too, I think a lot of fans, myself included, like the idea of Vicky somehow being related directly to Liz, is that she'd be a Collins, and there's this whole idea in, the whole trope in Gothic literature of the hidden lineage, that she's connected to this core family, here of this cursed family, but she is directly connected to it. And I think that's part of it too, because otherwise she's Paul Stoddard's daughter, but she's not Liz's daughter. So she would have that blood connection to the Collins family. But that said, there is certainly a strong argument to be made that she's Paul Stoddard's daughter, because that's what Art Wallace intended to begin with.
Who knows? And you raise an interesting point about family connection. I think that aspect is why I like the 1991 version of Joanna Going as Victoria.
She was really good.
She's basically the reincarnation of Josette Dupre. And Josette did marry a Collins, so she's still kind of connected in that way to the Collins family.
True. Good point. Yeah. That Joanna Going was very good. They said, well, let's streamline this and have Vicky be the core character, keep bringing Vicky back into it. And I'm not sure if I like the merging of Vicky and Maggie, as we have seen in the 2012 movie. We had Vicky and Maggie were one and the same, and then when I just talked about the John August script, they were going to do the same thing. I like them being distinct characters.
I mean, they did make them distinct in the 1991 series, and Maggie had her own little thing, and she was doing tarot and had a relationship with Roger.
With Roger, that was not a fan of that idea, but
I don't get that.
That was that I wasn't buying into that at all. But I did like that they both existed in the series. Closing thoughts here from you on the character of Victoria and on what that character means to you.
I think I watching it as a kid, I felt like she was just a really strong character, and I could easily put myself in the place of that character.
Yeah.
I liked the fact that she was a teacher. At one point, I wanted to be a teacher, so I could kind of relate to her and, connect with her in that way. And I always thought it'd be cool to live in a big mansion.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
who doesn't want to live in a big mansion? But yeah, Victoria is just, she was inquisitive, plucky, and just a really interesting character. I mean, she's the audience's eyes and ears into this weird family that you get to know. And I just really connected with that, and it grew on me. And then when they took it away and just changed her, kind of put her on the back burner, I guess, all of her plots on the back burner. It's just disappointing.
It's crazy how that happened too. I mean, watch the show, and every episode of My Name is Victoria Winters, she in these diary entries, like you said, you're looking through her eyes into this strange world. But as it becomes more and more supernatural and bizarre as we go on, and they link Vicky with Josette. Josette's protecting Vicky, the ghost of Josette. I mean, she's certainly tied in with all of this. And then Barnabas wants to make her Josette, but he gives up on Maggie, and she certainly figures prominently into things even after Barnabas comes on, but becomes less of a central focus as we shift over to Barnabas. And this is just how the show organically developed. But in new versions of it, I think, it's important to have, I think, a Vicky component, and every version of it since then has had that. The 2004 pilot too.
Yeah, I was just going to mention the 2004 pilot with Marley Shelton. I thought she was an admirable Vicky.
Marley Shelton,
I was not a huge fan of everything that they did there, because I felt like they tried to cram too much in.
Yeah.
But I thought she interacted with Alec Newman very well as Barnabas. And I really liked the dynamic that she had with David. Yeah. She wasn't just shrieking and freaking out like Alexandra's Vicky did, but she just like, I'm not going away, and this is how it is. And because the aspect of Vicky as a tutor, we don't get to see that very much, even in the original show. And then at one point it just kind of drops out, and Roger even says, "Aren't you supposed to be teaching my son?" It's like, no, I'm too busy trying to figure out gothic romance stuff now, and there's this vampire that now I'm uncomfortable around him, and I don't know anymore. I just like, they just dropped the ball.
I don't understand.
I don't understand.
Yeah. What about Lara Parker also wrote a book about Vicky, Heiress of Collinwood. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of it, but I've never read it.
Yeah, I have it. I haven't gotten around to it yet, but it is about Victoria Winters. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Rachel. Can you tell us one more time how fans can find your content?
Yes, and again, thank you so much for having me on.
My pleasure.
They can go to my YouTube channel, Soul Twin Audios. That's SOLE. They can go to anchor.net, anchor.fm/Soul Twin Audios. And those are the two main places where I post my episodes. And
be sure to subscribe to Rachel's channel, and yeah, the great, definitely check out Dark Paradise, where you can hear more about Dark Shadows and about Strange Paradise as well. Thank you again, Rachel, and I will see you next time.
And for as long as they lived, the dark shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.